So let's talk through the strength of the armies of Warhammer 40k, how they're doing on the tabletop in terms of win rates and a bunch of other power statistics, and what units and detachments are seeing the most play from good players doing well with them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Warhammer 40k army power, going through each faction in the game and a check-in on how they're doing right now. Warhammer 40k updates rather regularly, and it does take a bit of time since balance updates to really be sure what's doing well and what's doing badly in the game, but now since the latest big balance updates we've had around about 6 weeks worth of tournament data from 40k factions, enough time to give us some insights as to what works in practice. There's plenty of places that collect and collate stats for Warhammer 40k armies in tournaments, Meta Monday, StatCheck 40k, Goonhammer's 40k Stat Center for their more casual win rates and datasets, and Best Coast Pairings and the other tournament things to see some individual army performances. Most of these have a good few weeks of data now. I've been looking at their things for the data behind this, so check them out, links down in the video description. For a rough and ready gauge of army power, I generally tend to look at overall faction win rates at tournaments. While it definitely has its flaws, I still think it's the single best metric, as it shows an average player going in with a list that's at least fairly strong. Though of course all sorts of things can vary it, things like the type of population that's playing the army, whether you're playing in a casual or competitive setting, the terrain levels, and the sample size can cause a bit of randomness, but I still think it's probably the most rough and ready helpful metric to show faction power in one number. For a bit more context though, particularly for top tournament performance, I thought I'd take a look at the number of players that have either won an event or have gone the first 5 games unbeaten. As to do that, you have to be playing with a strong list and overcome a whole bunch of players who are doing similarly, so as a better metric for sort of top meta performance. And then as well as that, for a bit of context, the play rates of different factions, generally things perceived to be stronger get played more, and then some slightly more casual win rates from Goonhammer's results, which has a bigger datasheet, but also will be reflective of the actual list that a lot more people are playing as opposed to grand tournament winners. Overall, for game balance for 40k at the moment, it maybe feels like it's taken a bit of a step back after the last wave of codex releases and balance passes. It's still absolutely nowhere near as bad as, say, 40k at the start of 10th edition, with wild faction win rates ranging between 30 or 70%. Player skill is still the more important factor versus the choice of faction, at least for the vast majority of armies out there, though there are around about 3 or 4 factions in particular that seem rather dominant and just feel like a next level of power compared with the rest currently. Obviously definitely room for improvement though, and feels like there's some really obvious balance changes that they could make whenever they choose to. In particular, certain armies getting nerfed, but it feels like there's some easy wins for factions that need some buffs as well. Let's jump into it though, and we'll start out with the lower end of the meta. These factions seem to be the ones that are struggling most at the moment. As ever, the obligatory mention for Imperial Agents, and then beyond that, Orks, Deathwatch, Dark Angels and Black Templars, all of whom seem to be at the 45% win rate or lower than that. I would still say none of them so far behind that they're unplayable, and besides Deathwatch and Agents, most have managed at least some top tournament performances. As we go along, let's build up on the big graph to stack up the armies in relation to each other. As ever though, I feel like Imperial Agents just don't really qualify just due to too low data. Nobody's really playing them. Starting with them though, there's not really too much different to say about them. Easily the least played faction in the game, and it's not close. What little data there is isn't very encouraging, around about win rates between 20% to 33% depending on source. No top tournament performances, and currently a faction with a lot of issues. Games Workshop did give them a small buff via an FAQ recently, saying that you could attach characters while units infiltrate or deep strike, so relevant for some enhancements for Imperialis fleet, which is their strongest attachment. Generally, when the Imperial Agents win games, it's playing Warhammer on hard mode, not really much damage at all, and then usually building around the Voidfarers units in an Imperialis fleet. Some Subductor squads, which are genuinely very tanky for the cost, some lone operative shenanigans with the Assassins and Kyria Draxus to deny some shooting, and then maybe some Deathwatch veterans with their movement shenanigan ones, perhaps some Allied Knights if you do want something that's fairly punchy. As usual, Games Workshop just needs to give them a rules boost. Top of the wish list would be to have some sort of faction rule that functions when they're not being used as allies, and ideally one that helps them out against tanks and monsters, which they just really can't handle in Codex properly at the moment. Maybe some sort of free grenades or lethal hits benefit against a target could be nice there. Their biggest issue is they've got no indication so far that Games Workshop is actually trying to balance them as a standalone faction, despite having set up the points cost in a way that they theoretically could. For the lowest placing couple of armies at the moment that are treated as real factions though, there's the Orks and the Deathwatch, both of those on 43% tournament win rates, and that seems to be consistent with the more casual win rates from Goonhammer as well. A few players have managed to go undefeated across 5 games with Orks, though not many, and they are notably lesser played compared with normal for the Greenskins, 17th out of the 28 factions. Usually they're far higher than that as they're a popular faction. For the last balance update, they gave some buffs to the Cult of Speed, Boggy's Copters and Squighog Boys too. They're ultimately not really quite enough to actually make those units strong enough. I feel like the Boggy datasheets kind of need a rewrite more than anything. They just struggle to be strong while they're quite this non-threatening. That came in hand with a bunch of nerfs to certain quite popular units that were good in tournament builds. The Shock Attack Gun Mech, big squads of looters and flash kits, big mobs of boys, and the trucks and the tank busters, which were staples in a lot of lists. Mordaka had been nerfed into the ground in the previous update too. Detachments-wise, that's left Warhorde as easily the most played, and perhaps seemingly the most successful, though clearly not doing great. Tactical and the Dread Mob being the next most popular after that. Orky Generals seem to be having the most success with various flavours of melee violence piled into transport vehicles, Boys, Knobs, Breaker Boys, and Beast Snaggers, maybe Mega Knobs with Gazgul, besides the latter generally making their way up the board in trucks, maybe Kill Rigs or Battle Wagons as an alternative. Flash Kits and Tank Busters are both good, and might be more standout in Tactical Brigade, and then Gretchen and Storm Boys are good for scoring, particularly Gretchen farming up their command points, and Storm Boys can do some tactical secondaries. Overall though, I feel like the main issue is that they just took some painfully targeted nerfs to a faction that just wasn't really that strong prior to those. The Cult of Speed was nice to see get some help, but it still doesn't really seem to be anywhere near enough for it to function as you'd hope it might. Most of the detachments are kind of niche, and quite a lot of units just sort of limp into being merely okay in their heavily buffed themed detachments, and are awful in most of the rest. Overall, between all that, certainly feels like Orks need something to help them out. Next up, and also on 43% wins, we have the Deathwatch. Their tournament stats seem to have fallen off an absolute cliff since prior to the last update, despite no actual main changes to their codex. They dropped down from about 53% to 43%. That seems to be consistent with casual win rates from Goonhammer. I haven't seen any players go 5 games undefeated for the first 5, and they're the third last played faction, only Templars and Imperial Agents being lower. With this few people playing them, it looks like maybe just a few good players have abandoned the faction, and that's really caused a collapse in how well they're doing, even if their rules haven't changed from when they were performing towards the top of the meta in terms of win rate stats. For their core rules, they use their Black Spear detachment. That does have solid stratagems with some good firepower boosts, teleport tricks, and some really nice enhancements as well. The Tome of Ectoclades and Thief of Secrets for some big melee damage are really nice. Then maybe some of their most impressive kill team datasheets are their veteran squads, the Terminators and the Indomitor big Gravis ones, led by characters like Gravis Captains, Judaseers and Watchmasters, one of those very lightly with the scary Thief of Secrets. Then beyond that, usually some small unit Space Marine support. You could perhaps use something like a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to mark some targets, maybe some Devastator Centurions as another good teleport style unit, and I guess the Deathwatch will have some sort of datasheet updates given the new kill team that's coming out. For whatever reason though, Deathwatch really seem to have dropped down a lot. Maybe they're not quite liking the Death Guard and Knights meta so much. With their big chunky units, they often have to expose massive great big squads of Space Marines. The heavy fire from bloat drones and big knightly weapons are absolutely going to chew up very fast. I feel like they are likely to remain a bit niche as a faction that people set out to collect while they don't have a codex, though hopefully the new kill team kits might draw a bit more interest from some people to them. Having one of their units be an aircraft with a Corvus Blackstar isn't great for them in 10th edition as well, given that Games Workshop don't seem to enjoy balancing flyers this edition. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Redgrass Hobby Gear. They're a well-respected maker of all sorts of painting support supplies, perhaps best known for their painting handles, wet palettes, hobby tools and hobby lamps. Really quite well established, and they ship basically worldwide, either via their website or Amazon page linked down in the video description. For a couple of examples of their most popular things with Warhammer hobbyists, they've got a straightforward and easy to use wet palette. The idea behind this is they have a sealed box to keep the moisture in, so you can mix paint blends on it really easily, with the slightly damp foam pad basically keeping paint workable for a very long amount of time. Really great if you're trying to do any sort of advanced blending techniques. Otherwise, another really enjoyed one for Warhammer hobbyists is their painting handle. Maybe one of the more recommended tools for people painting stuff. The idea is that it holds your model onto the top of it so you can rotate it around, making it solidly easier and a bit more ergonomic to grip rather than holding onto the base. The models get held in place by a modelling putty at the top. It's got a magnetic base if you want to attach it to a surface, and there's some swappable caps that are sold separately, and that means that you could have an entire squad basically ready to go bit by bit and swapping out the cap rather than the model to change from one to the next. In any case though, there'll be links down in the video description if you want to check them out. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Getting back to our look through the 40k factions though, and next up we have the Dark Angels. It seems that despite getting a bunch of buffs to the Lion, plus a new detachment that people seem to have embraced as the strongest way to play, it doesn't overall seem to have actually led to particularly great performance for them. They've still got tournament win rates of 44%, which is the same as it was prior to the update, although admittedly more casual win rates are doing better from the Goonhammer stats. They have had a bit more top event performance compared with the Orks and the Deathwatch, though not really by all that much. 5 people having managed to go 5 games undefeated so far, and being the 15th most played faction in tournament games, which is a little bit on the low side for them given their big popularity after all their nice recent model releases. The recent Wrath of the Rock detachment, with its -1 to wound for infantry and mounted things, seems to have easily taken over as the way that people play Dark Angels, and usually having a good number of infantry elites, inner circle companions, Deathwing Knights, maybe some Hellblasters or other infantry damage dealers, and almost certainly a character with the fighting damage relic enhancement. Even with this though, they're only just about limping into the lower end of the 40k power spectrum, though it does seem to be doing better in more casual games as opposed to competitive ones, which I feel like kind of makes sense. It's sort of doing a bit of a stat check thing with the Deathwing Knights, -1 to wound, -1 damage, big 4 wound defensive profiles. That's going to be the sort of thing that plenty of armies struggle to deal with, but just might not have quite as much standout value in topping GTs. Otherwise for choices, Azrael remains basically auto-include for its command point generation and big squad buffs, and the line got a solid improvement, going from playable to genuinely quite strong. Still not everyone uses him though. Overall though, despite some nice improvements, they still seem to be just lacking for a bit of raw power currently. They do have some good datasheets, though quite a lot of the rest of their codex just isn't really very good. Most of their character datasheets, besides the 2 mentioned, don't get played, and the Wrath of the Rock maybe doesn't seem to be doing enough to make itself significantly better than the core codex Space Marine detachments, even if it is played more. I feel like they wouldn't really be needing too much to head up towards the mid-tier. I feel like it would significantly help them if armies like Death Guard, Knights and Chaos Knights got nerfs as well. Next up, and just very slightly ahead on the win rates at 45%, are the Black Templars. They're on 45 it seems, which is an improvement of +3 since prior to balance updates. Still, despite having a few units having small buffs in the last update, it doesn't really seem to have changed things in a major way for the Black Templars. Helbrecht's Grimaldus and the Sword Brethren went down a touch. It definitely doesn't look like that's been enough for people to be returning to the faction in a big amount though. It seems that they're the lowest played army in tournaments in Warhammer 40k in general at the moment, second only to the Imperial Agents. It is pretty uncommon to see Deathwatch not be in that position. Despite a tiny player base though, it looks like 2 people have managed to go 5 games undefeated in a grand tournament, which actually when weighted for numbers of players is fairly impressive. The Black Templars are getting their codex at the end of this week, so things are likely going to change for them in a big way. Before that, though, for their index form, they used the Righteous Crusaders detachment, getting either Feel No Pain or damage buffs, then some nice melee tricks like stopping enemies from falling back so easily. For their standout units, maybe Helbrecht with Sword Brethren is the most impressive, and the Emperor's Champion is a solid melee beatstick. And they have the 10 Houses Bones enhancement that can make an unusually durable Assault Terminator squad with a 5+ Feel No Pain. Again, feels like they're kind of lacking for a little bit of raw power. I feel like they easily had some room for some more small points decreases if they wanted to do that. Though it seems that the Codex is going to change everything up, and they're going to have Templar vows as their main rule rather than Oath of Moment, though at time of recording we've got yet to see what their detachments will do. Hopefully if the Codex rules do wind up being fun overall, that should attract a few people to play them in events once again. Next up we've got 5 factions in the sort of lower mid-tier. These ones with win rates within Games Workshop's previously stated targets of 45 to 55, though still seemingly on the lower end for the average player at least. Most of these have achieved some tournament success since the update, and definitely aren't entirely out of the running there. In particular, Tyranids and Space Marines have got plenty of high placings, though when you weight that for the sheer amount of people that are playing them, it becomes a bit less impressive as a statistic. In any case, here they are on the chart. We've got Space Marines, Grey Knights and Tyranids all on 46%, and then Admech and the Emperor's Children on 47%. Space Marines are the first of them on 46 at Grand Tournaments, dropping down to just 43 in the more casual datasets from Goonhammer. Either way, certainly on the lower end of the 40k power spectrum for the average player at least. Despite that, as mentioned, they have had a fair few high placings, 8 players managing to go 5 games undefeated with various lists for them. Though given that they're one of the more popular factions and just generally tend to be because people like playing them, that still is lower than most if you waited for players. They're the 5th most played faction out of 28. The last balance changes did have some help for the Space Marines. They got cheaper Hellblasters, Aggressors, Vanguard Veterans, Heavy Intercessors, the Jump Captain and Calgar. There are also a couple of nerfs to the Ultramarines, Guilliman only having 1 free Strass Jump per turn or 1 discounted one. And if you have Calgar and Guilliman in the same list, then Calgar doesn't generate his bonus command points, but it doesn't seem to have stopped some people from playing him there and having good success in tournament lists with them. Seems that Calgar's got enough to justify him in just a great big tanky melee brawler unit alongside some company heroes. For stronger options at the moment, the Gladius is the most used and most successful. Then beyond that, the Vanguard, Ironstorm and Stormlands also seem to have some good play, The Firestorm gets used quite a bit, but usually seems to trail the rest in terms of performance. Easily the most successful chapter does tend to be the Ultramarines, though I feel like maybe the others have narrowed the gap a bit after the repeated sets of balance updates. And then alongside that, Space Marines generally tend to go in for their small units of 5-man squads with their various special rules, things like Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors, Incursors, or Jump Intercessors, all working together can all fill out good battlefield roles. Then usually some tanks or dreadnoughts for fire support, things like Vindicators or Ballistus dreadnoughts, maybe a combi weapon lieutenant for some utility, and then damage combos might vary a bit depending on the detachment and perhaps chapter. The biggest issue is perhaps that the Space Marine army just tends to be really quite variable. I feel like an optimised tournament Ultramarines list is going to be far stronger than the average thing that any random chapter and detachment could assemble. There are plenty of units in Codex Space Marines that are just about usable but not really stand out. A good list played well though certainly has a good chance of performing at a top tournament level with their scary damage with their boosted oath of moment. I suppose Space Marines and specifically the non-Ultramarines should be getting some new characters in the not too distant future. I guess that could at least have some chance of giving a few more incentives to making some of the other Codex chapters strong, depending on how powerful and impactful their new rules are. Next up, we've got the Knights of Titan. The Grey Knights have their Codex coming out later in this week. For their index rules though, they have been on a bit of a downward swing recently, win rates of 46% and seemingly worse casually at 43% once again, seemingly mirroring the Space Marines there. They're not being played a particularly large amount, 21st out of the 28 factions in terms of play rates, and just 2 people have managed to go the first 5 games undefeated in grand tournaments with them. The last update didn't really have any major changes for them, a very slightly cheaper Brotherhood champion, the 10-man squads of Terminators got a touch cheaper, and the rules for the Warpbane rerolls had a quality of life change so they don't prevent rerolls in melee. For strong Grey Knights at the moment, the vast majority of people tend to be playing the Warpbane Task Force over the Teleport Strike Force, the big rerolls for Dread Knights being a big draw, Purifier's can hit fairly hard, and you can deliver units to 6-inch deep strike charges easily enough. Grey Knights tend to go very heavy on the Dread Knights at the moment, given that they're the units that are strong against tough stuff like enemy tanks and monsters, perhaps more important than usual with Knights stomping around. It's not uncommon to see 4 Dread Knights or more, then most of the rest of the Codex is fairly usable beyond that. Caldor Drago and a squad of Terminators for him to deliver are quite a nice combo. The Purifiers in the Warpbane have a few nice incentives there, and both some strikes and interceptors are nice enough for their utility value combined with their damage. For weaknesses for them, they still struggle to punch up into tough stat lines even if they are using a whole bunch of Dread Knights, maybe not the best for toughness 11 Knights when your heavy Psy Cannons are strength 10. Their teleport movement shenanigans are certainly helpful, but not all the time. They don't help so much with delivering units to melee, holding primary objectives, and if the opponents can screen out a good chunk of the board, then they'll be less useful there. Hopefully the 5 new detachments in their codex will have some good interest though, and it's a chance for Games Workshop to rewrite some datasheets if they feel that it's needed. Both sentiment and win rate performance don't seem to be particularly strong on the tournament scene at the moment though. Next up, we've got the Tyranids, also on 46% win rate, and they seem to have had a bit of a drop off from 50 prior to the last balance update. Their casual performance seems to be a bit better than their competitive at 48% versus 46%, though still loads of people are choosing to put them on the table. The third most popular faction in grand tournaments, and the big numbers of players have managed to win a good number of events, and between that and 5-0 initial runs, that puts them at 11 in total on that metric, though admittedly it does still work out to be kind of middling if you weight per the numbers playing them. The last balance update was broadly positive stuff for them, aside grades to Hive Tyrants between the stratagems and the cheaper points, some new interesting Ravener datasheets, the Subterranean Assault being a really interesting detachment that lots of people are making good use of, and the Sarcophage having its rules changed around, maybe less helpful for some detachments, but can certainly buff some melee rather well now. For detachments being used in tournament lists, Invasion Fleet and the Subterranean Assault seem to be the ones that are most played currently, with out of the two, the Subterranean Assault tending to have a better time in terms of stats. That's their new detachment that gives them army-wide reroll ones to hit, and then really easy delivery to 6-inch charges, and some nice movement trick shenanigans allowing you to burrow into some tunnels and pop up out of other ones, potentially completely changing where the units are on the board and hopefully putting the opponent on the back foot. Invasion Fleet just has a lot of raw power though between some damage defense and useful stratagems, and Vanguard Onslaught, Crusher Stampede and Assimilation Swarm are all doing fine as well. For interesting datasheets, they often tend to start with some of the scarier damage dealers, Exocrines, Maleceptors, Norn Emissaries and Tyrannofexes. The Hive Tyrant of some description usually makes an appearance in most lists for the free stratagems. They've got excellent lone operatives between the Lictor variants, and a Biovore is well worth it to have camped in the backfield to spawn out spore mines for board control and occasionally doing some secondaries. The Broodlords and the Genestealers are a big threat, it's nice to have some sort of endless multitudes to sweep some OC onto objectives, and then many of the detachments have their own keyworded units that you'll need some of, such as tunnelers for the subterranean assault. Like the Grey Knights, they also tend to have a problem with big tough targets, and again that's probably not ideal in an era of Knights and Chaos Knights stomping all around. They only have so many weapons that are going to be that effective against Toughness 11, and big scary Knight armies can put out a whole load of bodies with that sort of stat line. I feel like the stats maybe imply that Tyranids are an army that people aren't currently finding a lot of easy success with, though perhaps a few talented players playing to perfection are able to get a whole load of mileage out of them. Next up, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus. They're on 47%, so have risen up very slightly since their last balance update. It's the same as their win rate casually. They've just had the one performance, it looks like, when they've gone undefeated in the first 5 games. Though unfortunately very few people indeed are choosing to put them on the table at the moment, the 25th most played faction out of 28. Games Workshop gave them a few nudges towards the positive power end of the spectrum, with Castellan robots getting Doctriners, some cheaper Scorpius tanks and Iron Striders, and they also got their new Servitor Battleclade unit, which could be alright for some action-doing cheapish chaff. For their stronger list at the moment, most people are playing the Halo Screed Battleclade, the one with the Override units, plenty of useful buffs for Cataphrone Breachers, nice support for Rust Stalkers, and more. Some like the Hunter cohort as well, and are having good success there too. Most of the army is playable to a greater or lesser extent. Skitarii troops are needed for their buffs, and they have a bit of their own damage threat. Taraxian infiltrators can score. Rust Stalkers are a solid melee damage unit. Iron Striders and Dragoons are dangerous enough. The Castellan robots I feel like are reasonable enough for their points, even if they might still be a bit ponderous to bring to bear. Belisarius' call is nice enough for his cheap cost. Overall, it's looking like the small points decreases have done enough to keep them at a reasonable sort of win rate when they do take to the table, though I haven't really had many people excited to play the faction, even if they might have gained a touch in efficiency. Next up, it looks like we've got the Emperor's Children here, who have had a bit of a come down compared with their pre-update. Again on 47% wins, which looks like it's the same on the casual stats as well. And that's a rather monumental drop compared with the 54% that they were before, after taking some very direct nerfs to powerful datasheets. Just the one person managed to go 5-0 undefeated or better, and that was a great big tournament winning one just after the update. It seems pretty notable that no one's managed to do similar since though, and they're certainly being played a whole load less than before, 19th out of the 28 factions. The last balance update did really quite directly affect their strength, big points nerfs to the Wings Prince, Lucius, Noise Marines, and one good enhancement from Coterie of the Conceited. Fulgrim went down a little bit, but still isn't really considered to be particularly strong. For detachments, people are still playing the Coterie of the Conceited, the one where you basically build up big damage buffs as the game goes along. That might require a little bit of coordination, and if you fail to make kill tallies, it can mean that your entire game plan slows down. They do have some nice stratagems and some alright enhancements besides. They really don't have all that many units to choose from, and the lists tend to be a bit cookie cutter. Multiple squads of Lords Exultants with Infractors, Noise Marines potentially jumping out of Rhinos with Blastmasters, maybe with a Lord Cacophonist, Winged Demon Princes are still played, maybe a bit more rivaled by Mauler Fiends now, and a few Tormentor squads to do objective work, maybe some Spawn and maybe Lucius the Eternal. For their weaknesses, their main disadvantages are that they move fast and hit pretty hard but aren't really all that tough. They aren't really super well equipped to deal with tough tanks and knights, which are everywhere at the moment. I might also be disappointed if they run into things with lots of good screening. The points cuts absolutely seem to have really impacted their strength, and they certainly seem to be trending down in the win rates, and it would be quite nice to see some buffs for Fulgrim and the Flawless Blades, which still very rarely see tournament play. Moving onwards and upwards, here we have maybe some of the most middling factions of Warhammer 40k. 5 factions all on 48% wins, though having really quite different characters of army to come out with that number. Here we have the Astra Militarum, the Tau Empire, the Space Wolves, Chaos Space Marines, and Adeptus Custodes. First up, starting with the Imperial Guard, they seem to have been having perhaps a surprisingly good time in the last few weeks of tournaments. They had around about 46% wins prior to the update, broadly got nerfs but seem to somehow be going up a touch. It does look like they've had a good couple of weeks. There's really quite a big disparity between competitive win rates and the casual ones, which look like they're all the way down at 43. And while they seem to be doing kind of fine for a win rate sort of perspective in tournaments, they're not doing quite so great at actually topping tournaments. Only 4 players have managed to either win events or go 5 games undefeated. That feels kind of notably low for Guard. I feel like they usually tend to be a faction that tend to perform very well in the hands of a few skilled players, but maybe not the easiest faction to get the most out of as a non-expert. In terms of play rates, they're fairly middling at 12th out of the 28 factions, though that is kind of low for the Guard in general. The last balance changes did hit their top list fairly hard. Tauroxes, Lehman Russ battle tanks, Creed and 20 strong Krieg increased, and the buffs that they got were maybe a touch on the borderline side. Bulgarins, Aquilons and Death Riders dropping a little, but only really to get them to the point of being sort of okay, and Lord Solar ordering Titanics is fun, but unlikely to really add to faction strength. The two detachments most used in competitive play are the Hammer of the Emperor and the Combined Arms Regiment, both of which have had a good bit of success. Some people have been making good use of the recon element and mechanized formations. I remember someone won a tournament with a horde heavy recon list, though both of those are pretty significantly lesser plays. For stronger standout units, Rogel Dawn tank commanders, the Ross variants and Hellhounds often provide the core of the damage. Big scary stat lines that can use the guard synergy buffs well, with things like Scout Sentinels, Leman Russ Exterminators and Hellhounds lighting the way for some big damage. Kazakin transports are really nice, some choosing to use Chimeras over the Tauroxes now, and then there's plenty of variants of infantry to scrap for objectives, Cadians with the sticky objectives, command squads maybe with Creed for some orders, and Kaschan jungle fighters to swarm the midboard. Gaunt's Ghosts are usually handy enough to have jumping on and off the board as well, doing secondary objectives and utility stuff. For their biggest issues, probably the main one is just taking some fairly direct nerfs to previous top builds, and the disparity between the win rates of competitive and casual I think is maybe a little telling, maybe doing a bit better with optimized competitive lists as opposed to more casual games. I feel like maybe that fits with the general vibe of a bunch of units being really quite strong, but there being quite a lot of stuff that is just very, very weak indeed. Lots of the utility artillery just isn't very good. Death Riders and Dryer and the Combat Engineers are all a bit on the costly side. Feels like a few things could either use some rules boosts or points decreases. Overall though, they seem to be not in the most terrible place on the win statistics though. Next up, we've got the Tau Empire, who Games Workshop gave a pretty serious buff with their rewritten army rule, but also did make a few changes to perhaps temper the effect a little bit, and the overall effect seems to be that they're quite well balanced. Win rates of 48%, and again, like the Guards, seem to be an army that's doing far worse in more casual games, down at 43% or so. Maybe again implying an army that's better in the hands of optimised lists and people who know the faction really well. Despite a fairly middling win rates, they're doing quite well at punching up towards the tops of tournaments. They've had 8 players either win events or go the first 5 games undefeated. Fairly good performance there. That's to put them on the slightly upper end of the 40k power spectrum if you weighted them for numbers of people playing them. Currently they're the 16th most played army out of the 28. The last balance update made their core rule just function in a lot more of a quality of life way, not having big penalties for splitting fire, and one unit can guide for a whole bunch of others, but at the same time they also increased the cost on the fairly vital stealth suits, nerfed the Carry-On detachment, and made a few other changes to Kroot and Pathfinders. As ever with the Tau, it seems like their detachments are at least fairly well balanced, lots of people playing plenty of things, though it seems that maybe Montcar and Carry-On are the ones that are having the most success currently. Montcar maybe feels like a fairly natural one to be going into things like Knights, probably going to have some reasonable enough Alpha Strike targets with a bunch of knightly holes and then lots of lethal hits, and the mobility to deliver them probably isn't the worst combo in the world. For units, the majority of their stuff is really quite playable. Stealth suits are kind of needed to mark things, then for damage dealers and bigger suits, Devilfish and Breachers punch hard, Hammerheads and Skyrays are solid long-range fire support, broadsides are usable enough for that as well, maybe better in Montcar. Riptides and Ghost Kills are useful in their own way, if not having quite the same amount of damage punch, and Crisis Suit combos are great in plenty of detachments, maybe building around certain enhancements. Pathfinder's very nice, plenty of people run Darkstrider. Piranhas are some good cheap interference and can be some good move blocking or trading style units, and lots of lists use one unit of Kroot for sticky objectives and Vespids to bounce around the board. Overall, they broadly feel like they're in a pretty good place, reasonable enough win rates, doing well to top some tournaments, and both plenty of units and detachments usable enough. Maybe the biggest challenge for them seems that they look like a higher skill faction to use, at least by the numbers. Often there can be some big decisions to make in terms of how fast you push up and score and take objectives and things, versus keeping important firepower safe. Next up, we've got the Space Wolves, which haven't hit the tournament scene for very long at this point. Their win rates, including their last few weeks' worth of index performance, have them around about 48% or so. Though for their new codex, it hasn't been in the mix all that long. Just the 1 week of proper tournament data at this point. Seems they got a 50% win rate for that, and a 46% wins in casual games since their book came out for people playing it elsewhere. The last updates were their codex, getting new detachments and rewritten unit profiles. The Games Workshop did have their first errata for them be to nerf the Iron Priest. He could give rapid fire to an entire tank's worth of guns, so basically have a Predator Annihilator fire with all the power of 2 Predator Annihilators, and seems they decided that was too much. He could still be interesting with the Gladiator Lancer potentially though. Post-Codex, for detachments being used, the Saga of the Beast Slayer looks like it's the most popular. That's the lethal hits monster hunting one, though has some pretty nice movement and support stratagems, and quite nice enhancements to allow a character to join Wolfen as well, to make for one very scary melee unit, as well as the Wolfen with their anti-keywords and the shields and hammers. The Thunderwolf Cavalry and the Wolfguard Headtakers seem to be the most commonly played elites. Ragnar Blackmane usually makes an appearance, often at the helm of a squad of 10 Bloodclaws with their big rerolls. Beyond the Fell-Handed is a pretty powerful character for the cost. Logan Grimnar is often included, and often just completely on his own, with his first turn arrival and his command point debuffs, and plenty of the rest is usable enough, like the Fenrisian Wolves, the Wolfguard Terminators, and Arjak. Beyond that, they can certainly make good use of the Space Marine utility units, plus possibly a bit of heavy firepower if you want it. Seems they're starting out in a fairly good spot. Nice to see one of their unique Codex detachments actually taking off, even if the other two have a bit more of a muted reception. I guess for criticisms for them at the moment, they do feel like there's a few units that just won't see very regular competitive play. The Grey Hunters in particular just seem to be costing far too much for what they do, and similar for the other Dreadnought variants. I'd also be surprised to see Njal Stormcaller in many competitive lists compared with the other options. Will be interesting to see how they do over the next few weeks though. Next up, we've got Codex Chaos Space Marines. They've stayed at a similar sort of level after the balance passes. 48% wins in competitive games, 46 for Goonhammer's slightly more casual dataset, at least a fair amount of top placings with 5 people having gone 5-0 undefeated or better, and pretty middling in play rates. The last balance changes had some interesting stuff for them. A bunch of lesser played units got cheaper. They had the Cabal of Chaos detachment added in, though it doesn't look like anyone's playing it. Perhaps some of the more interesting things were a big datasheet rewrite for Vashtor the Archifane, and also an updated Lord Discordant who sorely needed it. The detachments being used really seem to have changed around a bit though. The Renegade Raiders now looks like it's taken over as the single best way to play. Previously it was fairly even between that and Creations of Bile, but for whatever reason the Renegades are doing better now. I'm not sure if it might be a lot of scary Night Guns and Death Guard absolutely obliterating Chaos Elite Infantry, or the idea of getting close to Death Guard not being a great idea. Either way, some more mixed lists with Renegade Raiders seem to be the best, and Pat Bound Zealots is still doing well with its Chaos Mark system. Creations of Bile still does see some play though, as do Soulforged Warpack and Veterans of the Long War. The units being played are fairly similar to before, the biggest changes being Lord Discordants being really quite a common choice, plenty of people using Vashtor, and then otherwise it's the staple things like Chosen or Legionaries in Rhinos, some Cultists for sticky objectives, some firepower maybe with Vindicators or Predators, Cypher being a scary lone operative, Fabius Bile being a just solid choice both in and out of his main detachment, and plenty of other options like some big synergy things with Abaddon, and maybe some Bikers Possessed or Raptors rushing up the board for skirmishing and utility. If I had to say one main criticism for them, it really feels like Chaos Marines are an army where they've got a few good detachments, though the rest of them have some fun theme but just are very weak. Things like the Dread Talons and the Deceptors will be quite nice to actually see compete with the rest, and otherwise it maybe feels like core Codex Chaos Marines just is rather overshadowed by the Deity Legions right now, which are kind of stealing their thunder with their powerful new codexes. Moving on, and we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes, also on 48% wins, which has dropped down 3% from the previous update. In particular, their tournament performance seems to have cratered a bit over the past few weeks and is sending them down. They're doing better in more casual games, with a win rate of more like 51%. That does seem to fit in pretty well with Custodes anecdotes normally, usually faring better in a more casual environment with lists that might not be able to handle their stat check. They don't seem to be doing anything too outstanding on the top tables, with just 4 people having either won tournaments or gone 5-0 undefeated, though for now at least still seem to be fairly popular, the 9th most played out of 28. I really wouldn't be too surprised if that goes down gradually though. The last balance change that they had a small boost to the Alvarez Custodians. They dropped down to 60 points each, which wasn't bad as an already usable unit. And then for strong lists, it still seems that most people are playing Lines of the Emperor, some choosing to go for either Shield Host or Solar Spearhead and still having good success with that. The Lines is pretty powerful though, with the big +1 to wound that it can give. Some nice stratagems for big melee beatdown units fighting in the midboard, and some good enhancements for shield captains. For staple units, always hard to go wrong with Wardens plus a Blade Champion for just all-round good damage defense and a burst of speed. Custodian Guard with Keria Draxus still works well as a scary shooting threat and stopping them being shot at long range. The Virtus Praetors and Venatari Custodians are both good. The Alaris are nice with their deep strikes, and you could potentially split them into multiple units before sending them off individually in the lines. Some Caladius tanks can contribute some scary fire support, and some Sisters of Silence and maybe a Calidus Assassin could be interesting enough to score objectives. As ever with them, their main weakness is that they generally tend to be a slightly predictable stat check style army, marching up to the midboard and seeing if you can deal with them, somewhat at the mercy of 4+ invulnerable saves for whether or not they do well or not. Currently though, with Death Guard and the Imperial and Chaos Knights about, I do just feel like there's other armies that are just overwhelming people with sheer damage and defense in a better way than they can. And even durable Custodes profiles are going to struggle to the sort of attacks that the Death Guard and Knights can put out. I can't help but think it'd be a pretty rough game going into either of those factions. Just very slightly above the previous, here we have the factions on 49 to 51% wins, maybe the upper mid tier of Warhammer 40k. Realistically not massively stronger than anything that we've just talked about, though I feel like maybe most of these seem to be doing quite well in terms of tournament placings per the amount of people playing them. As always, good to see a whole chunk of armies clustered around about the midpoint power-wise between these and the ones just talked about. Placed here we have the World Eaters, Aeldari and Necrons all on 49%, the Chaos Demons and Blood Angels on 50%, and then the Sisters of Vassal, Leagues of Votann and the Drukhari, interestingly enough, all on 51%. Going through those, and first up we have the World Eaters. Tournament wins of 49%, more casual wins very slightly ahead of that at 51% from Goonhammer. Doing seriously quite well on the top tables, with no less than 12 victories or 5-0 undefeated runs. I think that puts them at something like 5th rated out of that, so that's really quite good going. And they are a popular faction to put on the board at the moment, 7th most played out of the 28, so really quite a lot of people enjoying putting their angry boys on the board. It hasn't been so very long since their codex updates. Like the Death Guard, they haven't really had any meaningful balance changes, just a few errata things. They did nerf the Spawnian Bloodletters thing for the Khorne Demonkin, so they don't have quite as much a godly deployment power as they used to, but did clarify that the Lord on Juggernaut leading units of Blood Crushers did indeed give them blessings, so that's still a very scary unit for that detachment. For the most part, most armies tend to use the Berserker Warband more so than Khorne Demonkin, and it feels like it swung back. It does feel like it swung a bit further back in that favour from after that change. +2 strength and +1 attack is just hard to go too far wrong with in a melee army. It does have quite a lot of nice good support, extra AP and some particularly good things for the Berserkers, with some big blood surges or advance and charge. Most of the unique units are pretty viable. Berserkers and Rhinos with Khan the Betrayer leading them is an absolute staple. The Foot Demon Prince is scary enough in himself and can do some free stratagem things. A unit of Jackals is good for sticky objectives. Small units of Spawn can go ridiculously fast and skirmish with lighter enemies very well indeed. Small units of 8-bound or Exalted 8-bound often tend to make an appearance. The regular 8-bound may be led by a Slaughterbound. That makes for a very punchy melee threat indeed. Forge Fiends give some absolutely brutal close-range shooting, perhaps to a weird extent for the melee faction, and Hellbrutes can cause some absolute carnage, not the most durable in the world, but if they can get in amongst the enemy units and potentially engage multiple at once, they could be fighting back multiple times over. On the Demonkin side of things, basically most of the demons are nice enough. A Lord with Juggernauts, Bloodletters to spawn in with the stratagem, Fleshhounds for jumping on and off the board, and Scarbrands a nasty melee threat. Overall, the World Eaters seem to be in quite a good place, despite some misgivings when their codex came out. The biggest and most obvious criticism is that Angron isn't as good as you'd hope it'd be. I've not really seen anyone using him in competitive lists, which seems a shame for the Demon Primarch that was so strong before. Would be quite nice if they could find a points cost where he was usable but not auto-include. Otherwise, the feel of Berserkers definitely feels weirder in the new codex. I feel like they really could have done with a base strength 5 at least. They're certainly still an effective unit, but it's just kind of weird to have them hitting at strength 4 outside of the Berserker Warband on the charge. Overall though, they're clearly doing well enough, and most of their units are usable to some extent or another. Next up, we've got the Aeldari, who dropped down a touch after the big nerfs to the Inari that they got in the previous update. 49% wins dropping down from 53, a little bit worse in casual play versus competitive. There's still loads of people are choosing to put them on the table in grand tournaments, and they have managed to win a bunch of events or go 5 games undefeated. It looks like 7 people have managed that. The last balance update had some seriously big nerfs to Inari plus some staple aspects, though it does seem that the Aeldari had units to fall back on. Plus they had a few small buffs to War Walkers, Shining Spears and the Fire Prism. It seems that at least a fair few people are choosing to take some War Walkers for their nice support rule now. After the update, it really does seem that Inari are properly dead in competitive play. Very few people running them, and instead it's the Aspect Host and the War Host that's taken over. Both of them played by good numbers of players, and both having some good success in terms of win rates and things, some enjoying Seer Council as an interesting alternative. Given the sheer variety of Aeldari units they have access to, lists maybe tend to be a bit convergent. Fire Dragons are a staple for destroying tanks. Usually around about 2 units of Howling Banshees are quite nice, often one with Jane Zar. One could also run with an Autarch as well for some punchy damage 3. Warp Spiders are fairly mandatory for their effective sort of 1-inch deep strike out to 24 inches, and Lycus is no bad choice with them for a jump in, shoot and charge. Dark Reapers can be a big powerful damage punch from a safe distance, maybe jumping in and out of a Wave Serpent with Aspect Host or War Host stratagems. Swooping Hawks are nice enough. Rangers really seem to be the common choice for Infiltrate after the Striking Scorpion increase. Maybe Eldrad Ulthram might make an appearance, perhaps with some Storm Guardians to sticky objectives and Bodyguard for him. Even with all of those seeing some fairly regular appearances, that's still not really that big a chunk of the Aeldari Codex though. It does feel like there's a lot of units that just aren't really that far from being quite good, but maybe just a small points decrease or something like that to bring them into line for some internal balance. It is a shame from Inari seemingly being flipped from being great to stand out weak. It did feel like a double nerf really, with quite so many points increases as well as the detachment rule being toned down in a big way. I kind of suspect that maybe some of the points decreases could be reversed and it wouldn't make them problematic, even if they kept the nerfed version of Lethal Intent. Next up, we've got 40k's Robot Skeletons in the Necrons, 49% wins, which does seem to have been a bit of a downward turn for them. I think people had some big expectations for them just after the balance updates. While they're still on the maybe slightly upper end of Warhammer 40k, they're not really challenging for the top spots quite so much. Certainly over the last few weeks, they seem to have been dropping on the tournament stats. They're kind of similar in casual play, and for their top table performance, they've had 8 games of either victories or 5 games undefeated, and that sounds like it's a fair bit, but given that they're the 4th most played competitive faction in the game, it's actually not really all that good relative to the amount of people playing them. They'd only score 17 for that if weighted for players. They were towards the upper end of 40k prior to balance updates and then got a bit of a side grade. The biggest buff was perhaps 2 Wraiths and Technomancers getting a touch cheaper, plus the Deathmarks, Illuminor Zeraz, the Doomstalker and the Plasmancer getting a touch cheaper. They did get a nerf to the Scorpet Lord and his favourite enhancement in Awaken's Dynasty, and individual Locust Destroyers going up a touch wasn't the best news for their small utility units. They're still certainly not in a bad place though, slightly upper mid on the win rate. For their detachments, it's generally the debate between Star Shatter or Awakened Dynasty for most people, both of which are doing well, though incentivise some slightly different units. Hypercrypt and Canoptek Court both see some play as well. For standout stuff, as well as things already mentioned, the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs do great in Star Shatter. The Catan can be a strong centerpiece unit for some might and can be a good target for things that boost reanimation. They've got lots of options for some nice secondary and interference style units. Imitate the Stormlord is good for some command points and extra stratagems. The Canoptek Reanimator can restore wounds very quickly to things, and 3 Scorpet Destroyers with a Scorpet Lord can still be a nasty damage hammer in the Awakened Dynasty. For why they've dropped back a bit, I might guess they might be struggling to deal with Knights and Death Guard potentially. It feels like quite a lot of their profiles are rather powerful into Necrons, and might be able to tip the balance of whether or not they can bring down a bunch of Canoptek Wraiths enough to start chewing through the units in a meaningful way. A lot of the Necron things that might just be near impossible to take down for certain factions just might not be in the same sort of league for armies with quite that much damage output. I'd guess they'd probably be doing better if those armies weren't quite so strong to suppress them. Next we've got the Chaos Demons. They're up on 50% wins, and they also seem to have dropped back a touch since prior to the update. They were up at 54%. They seem to be doing a touch better in more casual games, with Goonhammer having them at 52%. They still seem to be doing well to top events and go undefeated quite a lot, with 11 players having done so, which is pretty strong for their numbers of players. They're the 13th most played faction out of the 28, so fairly middling by that metric. That has dropped down since pre-update though. For the last balance changes, they had some small nerfs to the Shadow Legion enhancement, Nurglings going to 40 points with a 5+ invulnerable save, and a couple of shifts to the Tzeentch and Khorne detachments. Most players are still choosing either between Shadow Legion or Demon Incursion though. Shadow Legion with its deity buffs and some nice stratagems, and some really fun enhancements, particularly the Fade to Darkness Bloodthirster. Demon Incursion is the Warp Rifts blinking off the board style one, and can do some very easy 6-inch charges, which isn't too bad for a melee focused faction. For powerful units for them, Be'lakor often leads the way. Turning off shooting to units that are outside of 18 inches is pretty massive to have at the core of an army. A really big deal against gun lines, and then he's usually supported by a menagerie of greater demons of one sort or another. Bloodthirster and Scarbrand can bring some massive melee. Lord of Change with some magical firepower, though maybe the Great Unclean Ones and Rottagers seem to be some of the most common includes just loads of stats for the points. Otherwise maybe for some of the more standout utility units, having at least one unit of Nurglings for some infiltrators is nice. Playbearers can sticky objectives, Fleshhounds can jump on and off the board doing secondaries, and Beasts of Nurgle are pretty excellent scout and nuisance units with their big toughness regeneration abilities. For criticisms for the army at the moment, I feel like the Slaanesh units are still paying for the sins of their pre-nerf Legion of Excess. Compared with the other deity things, they feel like the most notably underpowered one. The deity detachments still remain a bit niche though again bar the Slaanesh one, I feel like they're all usable to some extent. I've seen both the Nodal and Tzeentch one have had some success in competitive games. Overall though, looking like a pretty solid place for the Demons, a win rate on the upper end of things and plenty of top tournament success. Now if only Games Workshop would confirm their existence by giving them a codex or something. Next we have the Sons of Sanguinius, also on 50%. That's a big rise of plus 4% from before their big buffs. For the casual win rates, it looks like it's more like 48. Loads of people are having fun putting them on the table recently, being the 6th most played faction after their big points decreases. And for top table performance, they've gone first 5 games undefeated for 8 players so far. Maybe a little on the lower side for the amount of people playing them. It felt like the first few weeks they had very little luck on that front, though maybe seemed to be turning a corner somewhat. The last balance change was a pretty enormous one for the faction. Really big points drops, Sanguinary Guard in particular going down to 110 or 240 is pretty immense. Also Dante dropped down, the Jump Death Company, Mephiston, the Bar Predator, the Jump Captain and the Vanguard Veterans. And there was a tweak to Black Rage for the Death Company, though it still hasn't really seen too many of them fielded on the board. For their detachments, both the Liberator Assault Group and the Angelic Inheritors seem to be having good success. Fairly equal performance, though more people play Liberator. It's just hard to go too far wrong with big strength and attack buffs, plus some salvage melee damage stratagems and advance and charge. Angelic Inheritors does have some good support for character units though. For their staple units, most of the things that went down are rather good. Sanguinary Guard basically seem to be in auto-include status, where it's very easy to justify taking 3 units of them at the 110 points, maybe building them out to 2 bigger characters with Dante if you want. Both the Sanguinor and Mephiston are fun punchy lone operatives with Fight First. Captains with Assault Intercessors can hit enormously hard, maybe with the Sustained Hit 3 enhancement in the Liberator group. Regular Jump Intercessors are enormously scary here, as are Scouts with Combat Blades, and basically all of the normal Skirmish Space Marine units they often like to take are just extra nasty when they can punch quite this hard. It's not unreasonable to take a small amount of backup Space Marine firepower as well, maybe things like Ballistas Dreadnoughts or Vindicators being popular. Overall, it does feel like they're in a good place. Not super overpowered it would seem versus the competition, but certainly not weak. Even despite some pretty spectacular points decreases, it's more got them to the point of being an upper mid-style army as opposed to one at the absolute top tier. Again, I guess they might have a little bit of difficulty into Knights and Death Guard. They certainly can bring down Knights, but might need some maximal stratagem inputs to really help them do so reliably. And closing with Death Guard can be a bit of a mixed blessing with their contagions on the go. Against most opponents, they're a pretty strong and scary army into the vast majority of the field though. Next up, and interestingly enough, we've got the Drukhari on 51%. That's around about 3% higher than they were prior to the update, having risen up a fair bit over the past few weeks. There's not so very many people playing the faction, being the 22nd most played army at Grand Tournaments, and having a bit of success on top tables with 3 people managing to take them 5 games undefeated or better. I know at least one of them was Mr. Scary himself, though possibly multiple. It does seem that even outside of a few tournament players though, they're not having the worst time in the world. Their more casual win rates from Goonhammer also seem to be 53%, and I feel like if it was just a few talented tournament players skewing the numbers, then that'd be a bit less likely to be so. Their last balance changes did make a few improvements for the faction. Slightly cheaper Mandrakes, Raiders, Ravagers and Venoms. Didn't take an enormous amount of points off a list, but they're all changes to units that were already good, so maybe fairly directly added a tiny bit of strength. And perhaps more than that, the Reaper's Wager getting just built-in rerolls where you get to reroll ones to hit literally all the time. That's at least a fairly solid damage increase to their most played detachment. Currently for tournament detachments, it's between that and Sky Splinter, with Reaper's Wager both being a little bit more popular and successful. For their units, the vast majority of the army is playable to a greater or lesser extent. Cabalites and Venoms tend to be a staple, Mandrakes for infiltrate and fade away, Beastmasters to block up the midboard and potentially nuisance charge things, Scourges to rain down scary damage, maybe some haywire from a distance, and Incubi and Lilith Witches hitting very hard out of transports. At least one Kronos is a good thing to have to farm up some pain tokens, and Talos are generally pretty scary for damage and defense. Much of their other stuff is very usable beyond that though. At least numbers-wise, they don't really seem to be in the worst place. Multiple usable datasheets and alright stats. Maybe being reliant on their allied detachment isn't the best thing in the world. And perhaps the single biggest complaint might be the range they've got at the moment. They kind of desperately need a whole bunch of things in plastic. I feel like their numbers might still be a little bit on the deceptive side though, and currently might show a bit more about the types of players who play Drukhari more so than the actual power of the faction. I suspect if you had a big influx of people playing it, then the numbers would drop off. Next up, and also having risen up a similar sort of amount, are the Sisters of Battle. The Adepta Sororitas seem to be on 51% wins and 49% more casually. Again, also a lesser played faction, 20th out of the 28, though doing absolutely notably well in terms of good players managing to take down titles and tournaments. No less than 8 players appear to have either won grand tournaments or have gone undefeated for their first 5 games. If you weight per the number of people playing them, then that actually puts them as the second out of any army around. In theory, for Good Sisters players, one of the most likely ones to be able to compete at the highest level right now. The last balance updates had some pretty nice and generous points decreases. The Castigator, Immolator, Paragon Suits, Seraphim, and other ones went down. There were some rules changes for the better for Retributors and Zephyrim, and in particular the Champions of Faith detachment no longer taxes miracles anymore, so it went from being a bit of a dud of a detachment to one that's genuinely interesting, focusing around 2 powerful units. It does seem to have been enough to tempt people into playing it. Good numbers of people still choosing to use Hallowed Martyrs, with some powerful character shenanigans such as Revive on Death or forcing units to attack certain units, and then Champions of Faith empowering the Paragon Warsuits and the Celestian Sacrosancts, which are already good units just by their datasheets, so having a whole load of extra powerful options piled on top of that is rather good. For more standout staple units, the Castigator is very powerful. Paragon Warsuits and More Than Val are absolutely devastating if they can get into their right targets. Immolators can split units of Battle Sisters in half for some nice cheap sticky objectives units with some interesting miracle dice abilities. Celestian Sacrosancts and Seraphim are both doing rather well, and they have plenty of good character datasheets as well. Fighty Palatines with Through Suffering Strength, and Caranesses are good. I certainly still rate them as a high skill army to play. Fragile units that rely on good use of terrain and trading up carefully and making the most of their limited pool of miracle dice. Certainly feels like there's some big decisions that you could get wrong and get a lot of sisters killed very quickly. Despite a bunch of Melter, they might also struggle to overcome tough Knight stat lines at the moment. Even with miracle dice potential, having to wound on 5+s can be painful, though I guess More Than Val can do alright into them. Overall seems to be pretty solid and scary performance for the sisters, though it doesn't seem to have drawn lots of people back to play the faction, at least yet. Finally for this level, we've got the Space Dwarves in the Leagues of Votann. They've got 51% win rate, so have gained +1 since prior updates. They started off just after the balance update with some seriously good tournament performance and have basically been gradually dropping down back to their 50% that they were before ever since. They've had 6 tournaments, either winning them or going 5 games undefeated. I think all of those came very soon after the balance update. They aren't being fielded in great numbers in competitive play, being the 18th most played army. They didn't really get anything significant in the last balance update, just some token quality of life changes to characters and transport, and as before they remain a pretty solidly powerful army with a bunch of focused damage against their judgment marked targets, usually the bulk of armies being mounted in Sagittars with some heavy anti-tank firepower and then some big hitting Chthonian Berserks charging out of them, often a couple of land fortresses at 2,000 points, usually a good number of Hernkin Pioneers and 1 unit of Jaegers to claim the midboard. And then pretty well everything else is at least usable beyond that, though some armies maybe being a bit take or leave on Grav Thunderkin or Einherjar Hearthguard. As they have been for a long time, they seem to be a solid, well-balanced and fairly straightforward army in Warhammer 40k. Lots of straightforward damage and defense things without so many enormous sneaky tricks. I guess as we've seen, they're going to be getting an extra 7 datasheets added to their roster, and a completely reworked faction mechanic in those yield points for taking objectives and then having damage buffs. Still could be a little while until they actually get their codex though. Next up, before talking about the big 3 factions, there's just another couple that stick out above the rest. We're jumping straight up from 51% to 53%, with another couple of factions doing rather well. Here we've got the Thousand Sons and the Genestealer Cults, the Thousand Sons on 53%, the Genestealer Cults on 54%. First up, we've got the Dusty Sons of Magnus. They've been having a rather good time since their new codex. Win rates of 53%, they're doing a little bit better on competitive tables versus casual. Goonhammer seems to have their more casual dataset at 50% there. They're getting lots of placings on the top tables, 13 players either winning tournaments or going 5 games undefeated, and one of the more played armies in the game at 8 out of 28, and that's notably high for them. They tend to be really quite a niche faction when the focus isn't on them. The codex changes were rather enormous, lots of updated units and detachment rules, and overall feels like it's breathed a fair bit more life into the faction. It was maybe a shame that they got some follow-up nerfs to the Warp Meld Pact detachment though. They decided to stop Spawn or Mutalists being able to access the detachment rule, which kind of seems like it's killed it for being a particularly strong one. For detachments currently though, it's still the Grand Coven that is the most popular and successful. The big magical damage one is hard to go wrong with in Thousand Sons. Otherwise, the Rubrique Phalanx is often quite well played as well, but just seems to be notably worse in terms of tournament performance. Grand Coven being more like 54-55% on the wins, and Rubrique being more like 46%. Most of their roster is fairly solid. The Mutalith Vortex Beast has some big firepower and useful buffs to nearby casting. Zangor Enlightened with the Great Bows are just really efficient for a fast-moving interference unit. The core of the army still tends to be Rubricate Marines, led by Sorcerers or the Infernal Master. Really nice magical damage dealing with some big overwatch, and can often be jumping out of Rhinos. They've got lots of options for other cheap viable skirmish units, Zangor, Spawn, Enlightened, or some Sekitar robots, paying a premium for the Infiltrate rule if you want them. Magnus the Red is very strong, and particularly so in Grand Coven with the magical damage focus. The Scarab Cult Terminators are still probably a little on the costly side for most places, but they can do fine in Rubricate Phalanx, and the Predator Annihilator has perhaps come out surprisingly well with some fairly serious anti-tank, getting some very good damage buffs against magic marked targets. Overall, just feels like there's a fair bit more interest than there was prior to the Codex update. They still feel like one of the more challenging armies to play. I guess that might be partly shown in the stats, with a higher win rate in competitive versus casual, a fair few moving parts, and having to think about what happens with your Kabbalistic rituals and whether they pass or fail. And several units don't have quite so much mobility outside of their sorcerer's tricks. Certainly seem like they're one of the strongest factions in the game at the moment though, win rates above the majority of factions, and are generally in a pretty good spot. Next up, we've got the Twisted Genestealer Cults, who are maybe a bit higher than I might have expected them to be here. Win rates really quite a big 54%, and have risen +4 since the last update, and they seem to be doing rather well casually as well, 52 there, despite a very small amount of people playing them at 24 out of the 28 factions. Maybe their single most impressive statistic though is that they've got 7 players who have either won grand tournaments or gone first 5 games undefeated. When weighted for the number of people playing the faction, that puts them actually top at that metric. So it seems like if you know the army really well and are a good player with a strong list, you might have some of the best chance of winning a grand tournament of 40k with these guys. They had a couple of small boosts in the last balance update. The Jackals dropped slightly in points, and then there were cheaper resurgence points for both small Pure Strain units and Jackal units. The small units of Pure Strain Genestealers feels like a particularly helpful one, given that they're quite likely to be slain early, so it certainly feels like it's quite nice to have more small units of Genestealers pop up later in the game and do utility and skirmish things. Previously, quite a lot of their detachments were getting good play. It seems that more people are focusing on the Host of Ascension compared with before. That's the big damage from reserves themed one, with some powerful things for units that have just been set up, often making great use of big blocks of neophytes with all their combined special weapons, led by characters and supported by other rules like the Achilles Ridge Runner, and then have a few guerrilla warfare and reserves manipulation things beyond that. Otherwise though, Biosantic Brood Surge, Final Day and Outlander Claw all have some good interest, and all focusing on really quite different units as well, Aberrants and Pure Strains, allied Tyranids with a bunch of lone operatives, or bikes and transport mounted things. Quite nice to have quite such a variety of different ways to play the faction. Again, perhaps like the Thousand Sons, they're renowned for being an army that has a lot of options and very powerful ones, but is maybe a harder one to play. Their units might be able to choose exactly where they go, but you need to make the right decisions to unpick the enemy army and eke out the most points, as their units don't tend to be the toughest once they're down, and pay a bit of a premium for the cult ambush. Overall though, people who know Genestealer Cults well seem to be having a good time on the tournament scene currently. Finally though, that brings us to the big 3 armies that seem to be stomping the meta at the moment. I'm sure no massive surprises here. They both seem to be the top 3 for win percentages and also top tournament placings, and either at or above Games Workshop's 55% win target they've previously stated in the past. These ones look like they'd be first in line for some balance adjustments, either in sequence or maybe in some sort of emergency patch. It depends how much of a problem they think they are. Here of course we have the Pestilent Space Marines of the Death Guard on 55%, the Chaos Knights on 57, and then the Imperial Knights all the way up on 59. First up out of those we have the Death Guard. Despite not having the single highest win rate on the board, they've got a pretty good claim to be the single strongest army in Warhammer 40k right now. They certainly don't feel weaker than the Knights. Their tournament victories are at 55%. They've dropped down a little bit since prior to the balance updates, but not really by all that much. Their more casual win rates from Goonhammer are 58%, and to my understanding I think the Meta Monday data doesn't discount mirror matches, and that can be quite a big factor when they're literally almost 10% of the players and the most played faction in the game, so in reality it would mean that their tournament stats would be a bit higher than this. Again, perhaps the single most impressive stat though are their tournament victories. No less than 31 players appear to have either won grand tournaments or gone 5 games undefeated for the first 5. So in terms of that statistic, they dominate by a really long way, over double everything else that isn't a Knight army. This wasn't really too unexpected though, given Games Workshop's lack of changes from the last update. Death Guard had this sort of similar kind of performance in the first few weeks since their Codex came out, and then they got no changes in the previous updates as they thought it was too close to the Codex launch. The only things they did were some housekeeping changes to Nurglings going up to 40 points with their 5+ invulnerable save. Death Guard armies have a whole bunch of strong and scary options. For the most standout stuff, it's either Virulent Vectorium, Champions of Contagion, or Mortarian's Hammer as the scariest detachments, Virulent Vectorium being balanced plague company with some sticky objectives, Champions of Contagion having some enormous character combos, and Mortarian's Hammer supporting their tanks and demon engines, and also marking certain units as afflicted, which is handy for getting Death Shroud Terminators to get the deep strike. Perhaps their biggest pillars of strength are those Death Shroud Terminators with the Lord of Contagion, absolutely monstrous melee damage and easy delivery if you can have some Poxwalkers make a unit afflicted, Plague Marines with a Biologist Putrefier, Foul Blight Spawn, or Malignant Plaguecaster, or some combination of them. They've got murderous range and melee damage when jumping out of a Rhino. The Defeated Bloat Drones with a Heavy Blight Launcher are just clearly undercosted for what they bring. Really punchy strength 10 and damage 3, and you can have a Lord of Virulence to coordinate that firepower. Mephitic Blight Haulers, regular Bloat Drones, and Plague Burst Crawlers are all usable. Mortarion himself is a great big threat. The Demon Prince with the 5+ Feel No Pain and Virulent Vectorium is a strong one. Typhus is still good, and a lone Tallyman can sit around in the backfield farming command points. Then to range out the front of the army, there's usually a healthy amount of Poxwalkers, able to contest the mid-board and put some OC on objectives, and importantly make some units afflicted by moving towards them. Overall, Death Guard are just a really tricky army to deal with a good army played well, and maybe particularly so for melee armies that needs to move forward and get into contagion range and have all their debuffs active on them. I kind of hope that Games Workshop go for points changes as opposed to rules changes to try and fix the faction. Most of the rules feel kind of fun and interesting. There's just a few units that clearly do far more than they really should for the points cost, at least relative to the average faction in 40k. That leaves us with the Knight armies though, and it seems that both the Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights are near enough equally problematic. The Chaos Knights having 57% wins, so a big boost of 8% wins compared with pre-Codex, and their more casual win rates with Goonhammer are even higher than that. They're not quite as widely played as the Imperials or the Death Guard, and they were pretty limited in terms of play rates before the Codex points came into effect, so still registering as a little bit lower on the play rates, but even with a slightly lesser amount of time to take tournament victories, they've still had enormous performance there, having 16 events where they either won the event or went 5 games undefeated. That's the third best there after Imperial Knights and Death Guard. The last update that they had was their Codex. It changed some knightly stat lines and shifted around the detachments, Lords of Dread and the Infernal Lance both being rather powerful, but the biggest and most standout thing were the big knights getting a kind of durability side grade, but absolutely enormous points decreases at the same time, to the extent where a lot of armies just really can't handle that amount of knights coming at them on the table. The Lords of Dread seems to be the single most standout one on the competitive scene. Those sticky objectives with OC5 are really nice, and the big stratagem for 4 rerolls against enemy Titanic certainly doesn't hurt in this particular meta. It does seem that people have taken up Infernal Lance in quite a big way as well though. It certainly seemed like one of the stronger ones at initial impressions. Diabolic Bulwark and some enormous power with either sustained hits, lethal hits, extra speed or extra defense, in particular that can make Gatling Despoilers just utterly murderous. For their stronger units, the Abominant, Rampager and Despoiler are all absolutely fearsome for the around about 325 to 335 points that they cost. On the Forge World side of things, the Lancer and Atropos are fairly standout. The Wardog Carnivore is still awesome, and the Stalker's nice with Scout, and they often take some allied demons along for the ride, usually Nurglings for some infiltrate, maybe with some cheap beasts to Scout for support. Overall, they're clearly doing very, very well, only bested by the Imperial Knights, which I feel like if you're putting them side by side, do have big numbers and enormous amounts of raw strength, and like the Imperial Knights and Death Guard look like they're probably first in line for any sorts of nerfs. Hopefully they can bring the massive power trip a bit back in line without having to send the army back to Wardog spam once again. Finally, that just leaves us with one, and right at the top of the shop are the Imperial Knights. They're up on huge win rates of 59%, and up to 61 in slightly more casual games. They're second in terms of sheer tournament victories, either 20 event wins or going for the first 5 games undefeated. They had a good bunch at the recent Games Workshop Tacoma Open, and they're the second most played faction out of the 28. They were having some fairly good success even before their big rule shift around. Their last balance update had the new stat lines to match the Chaos Knights, basically done as a digital update as the Imperial Knight Codex seems to be delayed for whatever mysterious reason, but basically their profiles have lower toughness and higher wounds, and the armigers with shorter range melter and lower OC. They did absolutely get the same massive points decreases that the Chaos Knights got, which seemed like it was going to be more problematic on them right from the start, given that the big Knights weren't even already really that bad, and Canis Rex was certainly already really strong. Most army lists tend to be going for around about 3 or 4 big knights as a result, supported by armigers and allied agents, Calidus assassins being particularly helpful there. Canis Rex almost always leading the way, then maybe often being backed up by the Knight Atropos or Lancer. Most of the other quest stories are nice enough, though perhaps the Crusader and Castellan are some of the more standout ones. They're all very nice with Mysterious Guardian warping them around. As ever with Knights, they're not completely unbeatable. They generally tend to have the raw hitting power to take down enemies, but might have the potential to be contained and then ambushed and hit hard as they move up. For a strong Knight list played well though, it's going to be an absolute handful for just about any army to cope with currently. They seem like they'll be downright oppressive at more casual metas. Again, perhaps good arguments to be the single strongest faction in the game, though the Death Guard and the Chaos Knights certainly give them a good challenge for that. Finally, to finish up, I'll just round up with a few lists of metrics. First up, here's the number of Grand Tournament wins, or players that went 5 games undefeated in a row. As just mentioned, Death Guard, Imperial and Chaos Knights all at the top there. Then Thousand Sons, World Eaters, Tyranids and Chaos Demons after that. Certain armies really struggling on the other end of the spectrum. Emperor's Children and Admech just with 1 it seems, and Deathwatch none that are good finds so far. To try and make that one more meaningful though, these are those same top games but weighted per the amount of players that are playing the faction, as obviously if you have more players that are playing a faction then there's more chance that some of them are going to get top places even if it was just by chance. And if you adjust for that, there's still really quite a lot of similar names towards the top of the table. Chaos Knights, Death Guard, Imperial Knights and Thousand Sons are all there, though as mentioned earlier it looks like they're leapfrogged by the Genestealer Cults and the Adepta Sororitas, both of whom seem to have been doing well on the top tables recently, though with really quite a small player base. There's plenty of armies that have got alright win rates but seem to be on the bottom end of that kind of spectrum though. The Astra Militarum and Adeptus Custodes are good examples of that currently, not a lot of top table performance, and Space Marines and Tyranids are both rather mid due to having loads of players despite some of them managing to do well. Otherwise, here's the player populations at big tournaments, again needing to be taken in context of how many people play the faction normally. Death Guard sitting right at the top though and quite clear of the rest. Then it seems to be Imperial Knights, Tyranids, Necrons and Space Marines. I guess Tyranids, Necrons and Space Marines all being a bit jumped up given that loads of people play those factions normally. Blood Angels, World Eaters and Thousand Sons are after that, all of which wouldn't be quite this high up if they weren't strong though. Here's the list of slightly more casual win rates from Goonhammer with their Tabletop Battles app. Maybe not really too different to the main thrust of the competitive armies, but feels like a lot of the things that are different make some logical sense. All the more stat check armies like the Knights, the Death Guard, the Custodes and things, they're all higher. And certain armies that have a reputation for being perhaps higher skill to play, things like Genestealer Cults, the Thousand Sons, Guard and Tau, they all seem to do worse in more casual metas. Finally, here's the overall Grand Tournament graph once more. Certainly feels like the stronger end of the meta is a bit more peaked than previous ones of this have been. I can't help but think with a few judicious nerfs to the things at the top of the table, you could have really quite a lot of armies scrapping for the top spot with the middle ones rising up. Certainly feels like Orks could use some help, and there's really quite a lot of loyalist power armoured factions that seem to be scrapping for the lower spots on the table too. I'll leave this one there for now though. Let me know what you make of current Warhammer 40k game balance with your armies down in the comments below. Finally, I'll just quickly cycle back to the video sponsor today, which was Redgrass Hobby Gear. As mentioned, they're the ones that make painting handles, wet palettes and a whole bunch of other useful painting and hobby supplies. There'll be links down in the video description if you want to check them out. You can either get things from their website or Amazon. The two most popular things are their wet palettes, as mentioned earlier. A really quite reasonable cost for keeping your paints workable for longer, and quite nice to be able to blend things while keeping them wet. And also their painting handle is really quite a popular one. It's just really quite a commonly used hobby product, whether it's this brand or another, for all manner of painters out there. I'll leave them links down in the video description though, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. That's it for this one though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support Auspex Tactics, then feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page. That's linked down in the video description below, and a big thank you to anyone helping out there. It does help keep the videos coming. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good or you'd just like to support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.